August 20th, 1945. April Harbor, Guam. The transport ship's engines rumbled beneath the deck as 300 Japanese women stepped cautiously onto the gangway. Their khaki uniforms were faded, frayed at the seams, faces hollow from months of hunger and exhaustion. Some were barely adults, teenagers pressed into a war they never chose. Nurses who had held dying soldiers in makeshift hospitals. Radio operators transmitting desperate commands. From a collapsing empire, students torn from classrooms and thrust into uniforms. All of them had been taught to believe that Americans were weak, decadent, and incapable of honor. And yet, as the women shuffled forward, guarded by U.S. soldiers, every expectation shattered. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary journey, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. From Tokyo to New York, this story deserves to be seen and remembered. The women moved in tense silence, stealing furtive glances at the Americans standing at attention. Their propaganda had promised monsters and cowards alike, but these men were none of that. Broad-shouldered, confident, moving with casual strength, their presence seemed almost theatrical to the Japanese eyes that had been conditioned to see only weakness in the enemy. Nurse Yuki Tanaka, 19, gripped her bag tightly, staring at the soldiers as if they were ghosts. If everything we believed about them was a lie, what else was hidden from us? She wondered. The realization hadn't yet fully formed, but it simmered beneath the surface as the ship prepared to depart Guam, the destroyed island fading into the horizon. These 300 women were on a 10-day journey, not toward mere imprisonment, but toward truths their nation had concealed from them for years. To understand why the first sight of American soldiers was so shocking, we must step back. Since the early 1930s, Japan had carefully constructed a narrative of the enemy. Every newspaper, radio broadcast, and classroom lesson had portrayed America as a decadent, weak, and racially impure nation. Its citizens were soft, its men unfit for battle, its women vulgar. Factories were depicted as idle, streets lined with breadlines, cities crumbling under economic collapse. This was not accidental misinformation. It was psychological warfare, designed to make sacrifice and death acceptable. If the enemy was already weak, starving, or defeated, one's own suffering, starvation, and death seemed noble, necessary even. By 1945, the women aboard the ship carried this worldview in their bones. Sachiko Yamamoto, 22, a nurse from Hiroshima, had spent years treating wounded soldiers across the Pacific. She had seen teenagers whispering banzai as they died. She had believed that American soldiers were starving, desperate, and cruel. When her commanding officer surrendered in August, Sachiko assumed that execution would follow. This was the fate of prisoners, everyone knew it. But the first crack in her worldview came before the ship even left the harbor. An American female medic, hair golden, uniform crisp and white, examined the Japanese women for illness. She worked efficiently, gently, without cruelty. When Sachiko flinched under the examination, the medic smiled. Through an interpreter, she said, "You are safe now. No one is going to hurt you." Sachiko could not believe it. Kindness from the enemy? This must be another trap. Yet when the medic offered a small piece of candy, the sugar melted on her tongue like a revelation. Something inside her shifted. By dawn, the ship had departed. The women were confined to the cargo hold, converted into temporary quarters. Bunks lined the walls, blankets folded neatly, and trays of food appeared for the first time in weeks. White bread, canned peaches, soft meat stew, butter, coffee, large portions of real food. For the first time in months, hunger gnawed at their bellies, not as punishment, but as a reminder of life. At first, none ate. They stared at the trays, suspicion etched on every face. Then Kiko Sato, a radio operator, hesitantly picked up a slice of bread. She sniffed it, tore it, and bit into it. Her eyes widened. Another bite. Another. Tears streamed down her cheeks as relief and disbelief collided. Slowly, others followed. They devoured the food as though the world itself depended on it. 19-year-old Yuki Harada clutched a chocolate bar as if it were a relic, savoring every bite while the words "this isn't a trick" echoed through the hold. Over the next 3 days, medical care, clean water, and improved shelter transformed the temporary confinement into something resembling sanctuary. Lieutenant Hana Ishikawa struggled to reconcile her training with what she saw. Americans once portrayed as cruel monsters were tending to wounds, sharing words, even teaching basic English. The impossible had happened. Compassion had entered a war zone. Even the soldiers wrestled with contradiction. Corporal James Rodriguez whispered to Private Eddie Walsh, "We're supposed to kill them on the battlefield. But here, we're supposed to care for them. Where's the line?" Walsh shrugged. "Maybe there isn't one. Maybe that's the point." For the first time, the women dared to see Americans not as enemies, but as humans. Tiny gestures, a shared meal, a smile, a gentle touch began to dissolve years of indoctrination, and with each passing hour, the belief that the enemy was weak, barbaric, or incapable of honor cracked a little more. By the end of Part 1, the stage is set. 300 Japanese women, survivors of a collapsing empire, beginning to confront the reality of the world beyond their indoctrination. A journey that will challenge everything they have believed and expose the true scale of American abundance, humanity, and power has only just begun. The morning fog hugged the ship as it left April Harbor behind. For 300 Japanese women, the Pacific stretched like a canvas of lies they could no longer trust. The meals continued, 3 times a day, each tray of food more bewildering than the last. Soft eggs with golden yolks, butter glistening on bread, thick soups brimming with meat and vegetables, dessert at every meal. To the women, the abundance was almost blasphemous. In their homeland, sugar was a treasure, meat a dream. Here, it was carelessly plentiful, and every portion challenged everything they had been taught. Kosato, a radio operator from Osaka, watched in disbelief as an American sailor scraped half-eaten food into a bin. Her mind screamed, "They throw away what we would kill for. They waste what we starved for." Her hands shook. When she cornered the interpreter, a Japanese-American woman in uniform, she demanded, "Why are you wasting food? Are you trying to humiliate us?" The interpreter's confusion deepened. "Wasting," she repeated. "It's just leftovers. Nothing else to store. Meals are made fresh 3 times a day." Ko's mind could barely compute. Her family had been starving for years. Her little brother's growth stunted. Her father weakened. Her mother's hands trembling as they divided meager rations. And here, a nation that had fought them so relentlessly could afford to throw food away as if it were nothing. The realization was crushing, humiliating, impossible. Even the younger women, barely teenagers, began whispering among themselves. Hana Ishikawa, a university student turned conscript, leaned close to her bunkmate. "Everything we were told," she murmured, voice tight with anger and awe. "It was a lie. All of it." Others nodded, but the words were more shock than agreement. They could not yet process the depth of deception, the scale of American wealth, and the human kindness they were witnessing. The ship sailed east, the coastline fading as the Pacific stretched toward California. On deck, the women were allowed brief shifts of fresh air. Sachiko Yamamoto pressed her hands against the railing, fog curling around her face as San Francisco's skyline emerged through the morning mist. She could hardly breathe. Steel towers, bridges stretching across the bay, docks teeming with cranes and activity. This was no rubble of a defeated nation. This was a metropolis thriving in abundance. It looked staged, unreal, almost cruelly intact. Hannah whispered beside her, voice trembling, "It can't be real. It's a stage set, isn't it?" Sachiko shook her head. "Stage sets don't hum with electricity. Stage sets don't stretch to the horizon." The sailors passed, whistling casually, unaware of the storm building inside the women. Everything they had sacrificed, every brother, father, and soldier lost, suddenly felt meaningless against this living testament to American industrial might. The train journey inland offered no relief. Cushioned seats, dining cars, orderly towns, and endless golden fields scrolling past the windows. For 3 days, the women watched in stunned silence. Wheat swayed in the autumn sun. Orchards ripened on perfectly tended land. Cattle grazed in pastures too vast to imagine. Machinery, tractors, harvesters, trucks moved efficiently, tirelessly, feeding a nation with ease. Ko, trained in mathematics, ran numbers in her head. America had not been struggling. It had been thriving, producing enough surplus to feed itself, its allies, and still discard leftovers. Japan had never stood a chance. At every station, American children appeared, clean, healthy, tall, full of energy. The contrast to the girls' siblings back home, malnourished, pale, stunted by famine, was unbearable. Each innocent laugh, each apple tossed carelessly into a trash bin, cut deeper than any bullet or bayonet. The propaganda had lied about the enemy, but it had also obscured the tragedy of what they had endured. The war had not been a contest, it had been a systematic suffocation against a nation blinded by pride and deception. By the time they arrived at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, the women expected harsh confinement, barbed wire, and cold concrete. Instead, they found warmth, wooden barracks, clean showers, hot meals, and grassy recreation yards. Sachiko stood beneath the spray of her first proper shower in months, tears pooling at her feet. So plentiful, fragrant, abundant, felt like a betrayal and a gift all at once. Hannah laughed bitterly. "We are prisoners," she said, "and yet they give us everything we were denied. What does that make our government?" Medical exams revealed the full extent of their suffering. Army doctors recorded severe malnutrition, low bone density, vitamin deficiencies, stunted growth, dangerously underweight bodies. American nurses, tall, healthy, strong, seemed like another species entirely. The women could barely comprehend it. All their assumptions had collapsed. Years of indoctrination, sacrifice, and propaganda had been built on lies, and yet, these were not monsters delivering punishment, they were humans providing care. By the end of Part 2, the women were confronting cognitive dissonance on an unprecedented scale. Abundance, cleanliness, kindness, and human strength all defied every lesson they had been taught. Their minds wrestled with anger, confusion, and a dawning awareness. The enemy they had been trained to fear had survived, thrived, and, in some strange, incomprehensible way, cared for them. The journey was only beginning. Over the coming weeks, the women would confront truths about war, humanity, and survival that would shatter their worldview completely. Camp McCoy became a strange, bewildering world for the 300 Japanese women. Every day challenged what they had once believed about the enemy, their own government, and even themselves. Wooden barracks replaced the imagined prisons of propaganda. Hot showers, plentiful food, and soft beds became routine. Yet they carried an almost unbearable weight of disbelief. Sachiko Yamamoto spent hours staring at her tray of eggs, butter melting over bread, and whispered to herself, "How can this be real? How can they survive war and still have this much?" The women slowly began to explore the compound, learning to navigate this new, surreal reality. The younger girls giggled when they saw green grass for the first time in years, marveling at its softness under bare feet. Japanese nurses found themselves advising American medics, explaining traditional remedies and the use of local herbs, while learning modern medicine in return, antibiotics, sterile techniques, surgical protocols. Hana Ishikawa marveled at the orderly filing systems in the camp's small library, something unimaginable back home, where records were scattered and censored. Language became the first bridge. The women, timid and cautious at first, began practicing English with the guards during work details. Simple phrases, "Thank you," "Good morning," "Excuse me," evolved into conversations about families, hometowns, and lost siblings. Ko Sato found herself correcting an American soldier's pronunciation of her hometown, Osaka, laughing as they struggled together. These small human exchanges shattered barriers far more effectively than any lecture or propaganda could. Letters from Japan trickled in, bringing censored glimpses of a nation in disarray. The emperor had renounced divinity. Cities lay in ruins, millions faced starvation, and families were scattered. But here, in Wisconsin, abundance was the daily norm. Soap, clothing, books, and medical supplies arrived regularly. The contrast was overwhelming. Fumiko Nakamura, a nurse, held up a bar of soap, laughing bitterly through tears. "We are prisoners," she said, "and yet they give us this. What does that say about our government, which gave us sawdust and lies?" Education became a refuge. Camp McCoy's small library, though modest, offered books on history, agriculture, mathematics, and literature. Sachiko and Hana devoured them, comparing what they had learned in Japan to the realities in the United States. Modern farming, techniques, crop rotation, machinery. They saw how industrialized agriculture could feed millions efficiently, how America's wealth and organization dwarfed anything Japan could muster. As the weeks passed, the women realized the war had never been a contest. It had been a tragedy fueled by lies and miscalculations. Even recreation was a revelation. Simple games on the grass, walking along the tree-lined paths, or watching snow fall silently at night were experiences the women had been denied for years. Yuki Tanaka, only 19, laughed freely for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. She watched American children play in small towns passed on the train rides, marveling at their height, health, and energy. The casual abundance of toys, food, and laughter felt almost obscene compared to her own childhood memories of rationing and malnutrition. The cognitive dissonance deepened. Each day offered evidence that America's strength, discipline, and humanity were far beyond what propaganda had ever suggested. The soldiers, once enemies to fear, were teachers, mediators, and in many ways, guides through a world the women had never imagined. The women learned to manage the compound themselves, organizing small kitchens, maintaining clean quarters, and assisting in medical care. They were no longer merely prisoners, they were participants in a functioning, humane society. Yet with adaptation came anger. The women could not shake the sense of betrayal by their leaders, by the system that had conscripted them into war and left them to die, all while their enemy thrived. Ko Sato finally spoke aloud what everyone felt. They knew, she said, voice breaking. They knew we were being sent to die, and they sent us anyway. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating, as the truth crystallized. The generals, ministers, and propagandists who had orchestrated the war were responsible for countless deaths, while America had simply survived and built. News from Hiroshima and Nagasaki arrived through photographs. Cities flattened, shadows burned into walls, proof of the devastating human cost. The women stared, numb, struggling to reconcile the horrors they had witnessed with the abundance they now experienced. Each photo was a hammer, each meal a reminder that survival was possible and had been denied to millions. By late 1945, months had passed. The women could walk without fear, eat without suspicion, and engage in daily tasks with a sense of autonomy. They exchanged knowledge, practiced language, learned history, and reflected deeply on morality and humanity. For Sachiko, Hana, Ko, and Yuki, the experience reshaped everything. America was not just a military force, they were a society capable of sustaining life, nurturing health, and fostering education on a scale Japan had never achieved. And yet, beneath the awe and gratitude, a seed of melancholy grew. They realized that the war had been unnecessary, that countless lives were lost for pride, lies, and delusion. Their own country's narrative had led them to witness death, starvation, and destruction, while the enemy, portrayed as weak and decadent, had simply survived and thrived. The bitter irony was impossible to ignore. By the end of Part 3, the women were no longer mere survivors, they were witnesses to the true scale of a nation that had appeared invincible, not through aggression, but through abundance, organization, and care. Their indoctrinated notions of enemies, morality, and honor were collapsing, and in their place, a new understanding of humanity, power, and survival was taking root. By April 1946, the long-awaited ships finally arrived to take the women home. Camp McCoy had become a strange comfort, a place of safety, abundance, and learning, but Japan awaited, scarred and unfamiliar. Each woman carried a suitcase of memories, journals filled with reflections, and a gnawing uncertainty about what awaited beyond the horizon. Sachiko Yamamoto clutched her diary as the gangway descended. She had learned more about the enemy than she ever had about her own country, and she wondered if anyone back home could even understand what she had seen. The voyage was quiet, reflective. The women watched the ocean, its vastness a reminder of the distance between the reality they had known and the truth they now carried. Conversations were soft, careful, tinged with disbelief and grief. Some stared at the waves, imagining the families they had left behind. Others spoke cautiously of what they would say once they returned. How could they recount a story of compassion from the enemy when their own nation had taught them to hate? Arrival at Raga Harbor was surreal. Japan lay in ruins. Cities were flattened, smoke still rising from bombed-out districts, and lines of civilians waited for bread, water, and hope. Sachiko's village had survived partially, but many streets were unrecognizable. Families were fractured, neighbors missing. The contrast between the abundance of America and the desolation at home struck her with an almost physical force. Yuki Tanaka, barely 20, wandered through the streets of Yokohama, shocked at the devastation but determined to help rebuild. Her experience in Camp McCoy had given her skills, confidence, and perspective, and she resolved to put them to use. Reunion with family was complicated. Fumiko Nakamura found her mother alive, yet wary, cautioning silence about the war. "Don't speak of what you saw," her mother said softly, as if words could undo the devastation. But Fumiko could not stay silent. She volunteered at a local clinic, recounting the story of the Americans who had cared for her and the others. Some patients doubted her at first. One elderly doctor finally said, "Perhaps this is how we rebuild, not with weapons, but with empathy." Her words stayed with Fumiko. a fragile thread connecting her experience to the possibility of a future. Lieutenant Hana Ishikawa faced another challenge. Her husband, a naval officer, had fought the Americans while she had seen them as human, capable of mercy. Their conversations were tense, filled with conflicting memories of war. Slowly, exhaustion and the desire for peace became common ground. They began to rebuild their relationship, piece by piece, learning that love and understanding could survive even the harshest indoctrination. The younger women, like Yuki, embraced education and service. She became a teacher of English in Yokohama, eager to share not only the language but the lessons she had learned about humanity, compassion, and resilience. Her students marveled at her skill, unaware that their teacher had been a soldier and prisoner, and that the lessons she imparted came from the enemy she had been trained to fear. By 1947, 15 of the 300 women reunited in Tokyo. Over a modest meal, they toasted their survival. Sachiko raised her cup. To survival, Fumiko added. To those who showed us survival could be honorable. Yuki whispered. To second chances. Hana finally said simply. To remembering. So we never forget what humanity looks like even in war. These reunions dwindled over time, yet the lessons endured. In later years, historians interviewed the survivors. Sachiko, now elderly, reflected on the journey that had shattered every assumption she had held. The Americans brought U.S. food, medicine, and care. How do we reconcile an enemy who nurtures while our own leaders sent us to die? Hana added quietly. The worst lies teach us to see others as less than human. What we witnessed was the truth that survived beyond war. The story of these Japanese women nurses, clerks, students, and soldiers was never one of battle glory or victory parades. It was a story of survival, moral awakening, and the endurance of human decency. The Americans they once feared had not only saved their lives, but reshaped their understanding of courage, strength, and compassion. The stone monuments of war told one story. Their memories told another, richer and more profound. Even decades later, the lesson lingered. In cities still recovering from conflict, in communities struggling with memory and history, the experiences of these women served as a reminder that empathy can endure, that education and kindness can rebuild what hatred and war have destroyed, and that the true measure of a nation lies not in its weapons, but in how it treats the most vulnerable. As they aged, these women shared their experiences with younger generations, teaching that enemies could become teachers, that survival was intertwined with moral courage, and that propaganda could blind a nation but the truth could always find its way back. And in this truth lay hope for reconciliation, for understanding, and for the enduring possibility of humanity, even after the darkest chapters of war. If this story moved you, give it a thumbs up, share it with friends, and subscribe for more untold war stories that challenge what we think we know about history.